What is good? Deepak Chona, SportsMed Analytics. Thank you very much for joining. We got NFL injury updates. It is Sunday night. Week 9 is just ending, and we got a lot to go through, so let's get to it. Starting with A.J. Brown. Now, the video on this doesn't look like there's any severe mechanism. He kind of got hit hard, landed on the knees. Now, there's no clear diagnosis yet, so we're suspecting a short-term injury here because, again, there wasn't any severe bend or twist to the knees that was really seen. You're thinking along the lines of potentially sprain or contusion, most likely. So really, to be determined on this one, practice return timing will be the key here. Then we have CeeDee Lamb. Now, he fell on his shoulder twice, and it's essentially confirmed at this point he's had an AC joint sprain, and that's the joint right at the tip of the shoulder. This is often played through for wide receivers, and especially for elite wide receivers, but typically with a production dip. Now, the real concern here is that if you fall on this again while it's injured and healing, you can certainly re-injure it. And we actually saw that happen a couple of weeks ago with Jordan Mason as well, very similar injury pattern. So with CeeDee Lamb, we expect a little bit of a production dip, but probably playing this coming week. Also very likely to be limited in practice as he tries to get this to heal. Next, Dak Prescott. So he strained his hamstring. He actually said, I felt a pull in that area, and he hasn't had one before, which bodes a little bit better. But as you get closer to age 30 and over, the hamstring return timeline tends to be a little bit slower. Now, the average on these is about 2 weeks out, but severity really does vary. If you return too early, you risk re-injury, and that's actually relatively common with hamstring strains, but a little bit less common for the quarterback position. Now, you also think about Dallas, and the Cowboys historically have tended to be aggressive about timelines with injury returns. So we're going to be watching the MRI and the announcements that follow pretty closely here. Data pretty heavily favors missing at least week 10. Most people would actually miss more than that as well. Then Chris Olave, pretty big hit, had a concussion today. Now, he's had a few concussions before, so the data here favors him missing week 10. There is a pretty high likelihood of a multi-week absence for players who have had several concussions. And it's not that dissimilar from the conversation that was had around the Tua Tagovailoa concussion earlier this year, in that these concussions result in a cumulative increased risk to long-term brain injury. So it's a personal decision as to whether a player would want to consider retirement. Now, Olave is pretty young, and prior to this, there wasn't really much conversation about his concussion history. So we think he comes back, but probably out at least 1 week. Next, Drake London. A little bit more optimism here. He landed really hard on his hip, and that mechanism suggests a hip pointer. Now, the average on these is about 1 week, so he has a pretty solid chance to play week 10, especially if he can log at least 2 limited practices, Thursday and Friday. So we're going to be watching those status reports pretty closely this week for the Falcons to look out for Drake London's chance. Then we have Keon Coleman. He was seen in a wrist brace, and he got hurt when he got hit directly to the wrist, and not really clear on what the diagnosis is. Being in a brace after this type of injury could mean anything, really, from a sprain to a fracture to a bruise. So we're going to be watching his practice return timing as well, looking at that as a clue for severity here. Next up is Brian Robinson. Now, he practiced in limited fashion 3 times this week, then was a game time decision. He didn't reportedly have any sort of setback. It was actually just that he was going to be tested at this pre-game workout, and then he just didn't pass. So he wasn't quite ready, but the indications are that he's very nearly ready. So we would very strongly think he comes back next week. Then we have Christian McCaffrey. So obviously been up and down year. If you've drafted him at the 101, we do have good news for you. We're leaning towards a week 10 to 11 return here. Week 10 is seemingly a little more likely to me, and the reason for that is because his average ramp-up timing would be about 4 to 6 weeks, and if you go backwards in the reporting timelines, that would put him about right now where he should be ready to return. Now, the key here is that if he logs one full practice this week, that would drastically increase his likelihood of returning and playing this week. So the other part of this Christian McCaffrey issue is that you would very strongly suspect that they're going to bring him back in a committee type of workload. And the reason for that is because these tendinitis issues, and especially in the Achilles, can flare up. They can get re-aggravated without a whole lot of warning. And obviously the Niners are trying to keep everybody in reasonably good shape as they go towards this home stretch. Now, they may not have that luxury of picking and choosing spots for McCaffrey just because they are not doing necessarily well, and they're very much going to be in a competitive NFC playoff race. So you would think that they will limit his touches at least when they can, but Christian McCaffrey should still be a pretty efficient performer in whatever capacity he does get to play. Next, Isiah Pacheco, a little bit later target here, likely week 12 or 13. The data on these ankle fractures typically does show about a 20% dip in efficiency initially. And couple that with a slow ramp up, usually takes about 3 games to hit full capacity with their touches. So running backs in the early phase are very hit or miss, very hard to use them reliably in any sort of redraft fantasy setting. But by the very, very end of the season, you should be able to rely on Isiah Pacheco again. DK Metcalf. So week 10 is their bye. He has an MCL sprain. The average for these is about 2 to 3 weeks, and he's now missed 2 already. So with that in mind, week 11 would be about 4 weeks into recovery, and for that, we would expect him to be back on the field. Then Caleb Williams. So the comments here suggested that Caleb sustained a mild ankle sprain. He was limping but walking afterwards. So data on these, especially for quarterbacks, does favor a return really as early as next week. But we'll watch the practice reports to give a little bit more clue on this one. Next, we have T. Higgins. So very limited info on his severity here. The average quad strain takes about 2 games, and he's now missed that much. But keep in mind that he actually got added to an injury report around Thursday or Friday of the previous week. So with an upcoming Thursday game, he's really right on that border of 2 weeks from his actual injury date. So we'd lean towards a week 10 or 11 return just based on the limited info we have and average data here. But week 10 feels a little less likely just because it is a Thursday game, so he'd probably have to suit up for practice very early in the week. Next, we have good news on both Jonathon Brooks and Keaton Mitchell. Both are looking like a week 10 return could happen. Both project to have very limited workloads here. Then we have Nick Chubb. Now, this is a real question of how much do the Browns plan to use him once he's fully ramped up? Because the data suggests that by the 4th week back, which for him would be about week 10 or 11, most running backs would be off of their snap count limitations. However, Nick Chubb, he has had about 16 touches per game the last 2 weeks, but hasn't done a ton with those. He's averaging 2.7 yards per carry this year. And unfortunately, although we are rooting for this comeback, the efficiency dip does project to persist through the remainder of this year, or at least the majority of it. Whatever workload we see when he comes back after their week 10 bye is probably the workload we're getting for most of the rest of the season as well. And last but not least, Amari Cooper. Now, he was limited in practice 3 times going into the week. Typically, this progression would have him come back by week 10. It's a little bit to be determined. We're going to watch the practice reports closely. We're suspecting he does another series of limited practices, becomes a game time decision, and most players would play following that progression. And that's all we got for the moment. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll catch you again very soon.